Now, the idea of doing this edition of Griffith Review came about more than a year ago. I published a number of pieces of Lloyd's in the Griffith Review over the last few years, and we'd had the experience of putting together an edition on Tasmania, and in a sort of fondness for small islands off the south coast of Australia, I thought maybe we should do something on New Zealand as well. And so I suggested it to Lloyd, and he went away and came back a little while later and said, I think there's something really important to be saying about New Zealand, which we could pull together in this edition. One of the other really strong impetuses for doing it was that I'd realised that through Griffith Review over the last few years we'd published quite a number of pieces by New Zealand writers who I don't think were known widely in Australia. I mean, there were some grand old names of people as well that we'd published, but there were some new people. And so I thought that this was a great opportunity to make available to an Australian audience a bunch of writers who would otherwise not have reached them. So let me introduce you to them. I mean, Lloyd Jones, I'm sure, is known to almost all of you. His most recent book is this one, and the previous, he's most famous, of course, for Mister Pip, but his most recent memoir, which is a question of science, History of Silence. History of Silence was published late last year, and I think is a wonderful sort of evocation of place and family. Alison Wong is a New Zealander who is now based in Geelong. Her novel, As the Earth Turns Silver, won the 2010 New Zealand Post Book Award for Fiction and was shortlisted for the 2010 Australian Prime Minister's Literary Awards, which is a nice measure of the sort of cross-Tasman sort of engagement that occurs. And Anton Blank is a Maori editor and writer who lives in Auckland, and he's interested in Indigenous cultural identities and the politics of gender and sexuality and how they play out for Indigenous people in contemporary settings. And the most recent edition of his collection is a combination of Maori and Indigenous Australian writers. So please welcome them to this. So Lloyd, tell me about your idea about Pacific Highways and how you were trying to sort of cast this forward in terms of a new vision of New Zealand rather than something which is caught in old frames and cliches.
Well, thank you, Julianne. Hey, thank you everybody for turning up tonight. Can I just ask how many are from New Zealand? I thought so. You can actually go back now. The weather's all changed. Well, how it came about was through the kind invitation through Julianne, and I sort of knew immediately what I wanted to do. Obviously, a collection like this needs some kind of thematic framework around it, and I wanted to rebut the idea of New Zealand's isolation. On the edge of the map there, but not quite seen. The second thing was it's become a very, very different country from the monocultural country that I grew up in. The world has now come to New Zealand, or if not New Zealand, at least Auckland. At the last census, I think there were over 160 ethnicities in Auckland alone, which is astounding, really, and it's happened very, very quickly. And of course, with the population replenishing itself in this particular way, there are social and cultural implications. Things don't stay the same. Things move on, as they should. The third consideration really is belied by the title. I wanted to take the Pacific idea in relation to the ocean, that it's not the thing that keeps us apart, it's the thing that binds us. And the old Polynesian idea of the sea as a connector, I think is a lovely kind of metaphor, the whole notion of highways, which is what the old Pacific Island cultures considered. The stick charts from the Tokelau Islands, for example. You have the currents and winds and all this sort of thing registered in a sort of a stick form. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay. I suppose to think of New Zealand as being rather than out to the corner of the atlas, but actually in a hub forget about where it looks like on the map. Doesn't really matter anymore because of the movement of people and the internet and all this sort of thing. More interesting to think of us as being in the soup of exchange of people, cultural ideas and so forth. And so I set about commissioning work. And just on that last point, for example, there's a young Taiwanese New Zealand poet, Ya Wen Ho. She arrived in New Zealand when I think she was about 6 years old. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting if she translated a poem from the Chinese classical era, a poem by Lai Po. It's called Clearing at Dawn. And there's a very famous Arthur Waley translation of that poem, which translates it fairly literally. But what Ya Wen did was relocate the poem, put it in a New Zealand context. So bamboo is changed to cabbage trees, mountain grasses to tussock, the leaping fish become trout, and so forth. As an illustration of how when people arrive, it's not just their person, it's cultural memory and artefact. And this is an important notion. And so, so that's where the expression Pacific Highways comes from. It's supposed to capture this dynamic exchange.
One of the things that really struck me as we were talking it up and then coming through in the writing was this note. I mean, I think from an Australian perspective, that we're very accustomed to large numbers of New Zealanders coming here. So this is a place where people arrive rather than New Zealand being a place that people are going to. And I think
it's a whole new thing.
The diversity and the depth and the sort of complexity of that is one of the real richnesses that comes through in the writing. But the other thing was that connection back to the very physical environment. So you talk about the godwits, and there's pieces about eels, and there's pieces about pumice, and that's sort of the watery sort of movement of the natural environment as well.
Well, it's interesting how often eels pop up in this collection, and it's an interesting symbol really of migration and transformation and memory, because in a poem here by Cliff Phil, he talks about he's just received news that his father is dying, and he imagines his father turning himself into half man, half eel, and swimming out on the ebb tide. And Greg O'Brien, he invokes eels in his piece. Noel McKenna, I think, has done some paintings in Sydney talking about the eels moving across, is it Centennial Park, and to the back of the Randwick race course into the sea, where they sort of change into seagoing things and swimming out to the Tongan Trench, where they breed. An extraordinary journey.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it's a lovely kind of metaphor, really, for the journey that all people make.
And so that movement of people, which is both ancient and more contemporary. I mean, Alison, in your piece, you've written about the sort of history of Chinese settlement in New Zealand, and that sort of that process of coming to terms with a place and the people's role in it. I mean, do you want to just talk a little bit about what
in April last year, I went back to the far north of New Zealand because there was a commemoration of the sinking of a ship that sank off the coast of the Hokianga in 1902. And the ship, the SS Ventnor, was carrying the bones of 499 Chinese men back to China to be reburied in their home villages. And it was also taking some very elderly Chinese men back who were very poor and didn't have the fares, but who'd been paid their fares to go home by other Chinese New Zealanders. And the ship sank, and almost all the bones were lost at the bottom of the sea. Quite a few people died, but there were some bones that actually washed up on the coast, and they were recovered by local iwi, local Maori tribes, and they were cared for by local Maori and reburied. And all this time, we never really knew who all these people were. The coffins, boxes, wooden boxes, had the names of the people on it, their home villages, all that information, but it all got lost. And we only know the name of one person who was on the ship, whose bones were on the ship. I know that there were 10 that were loaded in Wellington, but they actually came from all over New Zealand. They came from the South Island. A lot of the people were gold miners from Southland and Otago, from the West Coast, all the way, and they were all transferred onto this boat. And under traditional Chinese superstitions, people want to be buried at home, cared for by their families, ancestor worship, all those sorts of things. But also the worst possible thing was to be lost at sea, because you'd never find rest, you'd be a hungry ghost. So it took almost 111 years for us to go back there and do the traditional rites for these people. And although we didn't know who they were, we took them on as our ancestors to do the traditional rites for them, hopefully to give them peace. And there were about 100 of us from throughout New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, all over the place. And we weren't just Chinese, we were European, Pākehā, and Maori as well. And people from the local areas, that descendants of the people who had recovered the bones, came with us to do the rites too. And we were welcomed onto the marae, onto the homes of the Maori people. And it was very, very moving. We planted young Cautery in a grove of Cautery, because Cautery live a very long time, and this is a commemoration. And people from Mitimiti, which is where a very wonderful and famous Maori artist Ralph Cautery, where he grew up, his people created a Chinese gate painted red and gold high up on the hill, right in the burial grounds overlooking the sea. And it was right there near his grave, because he only died about 6 weeks or so before we went there, so I actually saw his grave. And it was a wonderful coming together.
And you write about it beautifully. It's a really very moving and very evocative piece. Lloyd, did you want to say something?
Well, indeed, it's a fantastic piece, and an Australian writer friend who read it thought it should be read by every secondary school pupil in New Zealand, for a very, very good reason, because Alison is actually, it's kind of a family history, but it's also a history of institutional prejudice against the Chinese community. And it's important, its place in the book is terribly important, because juxtaposed with that is the new, much more bold and confident Asian community arriving in New Zealand, who quite rightly are vocal and expressive and part of everything. But I did want to ask you a question, Alison, because it's pertinent to what I was just talking about. You said the bones of 400, all men. There's a reason for that, isn't there?
Yeah, because it wasn't just New Zealand. Every Western country in the world had an anti-Chinese view. And I've actually just been given a book to review for the New Zealand Listener called Yellow Peril, which goes through history the anti-Asian racism, and it looks incredibly interesting. So it was here in Australia, it was in Canada, it was in America, it was in England. In New Zealand, they just had a successive legislation to try and stop the Chinese in particular from coming to New Zealand, and they had legislation which is only against the Chinese and no one else in New Zealand. So they started off by imposing what they called the poll tax, which was an entry tax to New Zealand, which was £10 in the 1880s. The interesting thing is, originally it was the Chinese who were invited to New Zealand because the goldfields were drying up, and in Otago they were really worried that the economy was plummeting because everyone was leaving. It was too hard to get gold out, but they knew that the Chinese worked really hard and they weren't put off by difficulty. So they invited Chinese gold miners from Victoria to Otago. And there were 2 lots that came through, and they guaranteed their safety, that they'd be treated well, all those sorts of things. And they did, help to revitalise the economy, and they actually got gold out from areas that were too difficult for anyone else to bother about, because they worked together to do it. But within no time at all, everyone got very anti about it because they felt there were too many Chinese now. Mostly it was just men, because it was too hard for women to come out to the gold fields and live in awful conditions, segregated from everyone else in a tiny, tiny little hut or tent in the freezing snow, completely unsupported. But then when they started imposing all this legislation, it became so expensive for Chinese to come. It ended up being £100, which was a lifetime savings just to enter the country, let alone, the fares and your expenses. So that made it very, very difficult to bring women out. If you managed to save that much money so that you could bring someone else out, you brought out someone who could also make more money, another male, your son or your brother or something like that. In fact, of the very few Chinese women that did come out, mostly they were all from my home county, because my home county in southern China, in Guangdong, happened to be, I think, a slightly more progressive county. And somehow we managed to keep our families a bit more together. But in my own family, it wasn't just the taxes. It was also, you had English reading tests that no one else had to pass. You had thumbprinting. You had... we didn't receive any benefits. We were not able to be naturalised. Naturalisation for Chinese only came back in 1952. We were the only people who could not get the pension, even if we were born in New Zealand. We were the only ones that didn't get any family benefits, and all of those sorts of things. It was very, very difficult. So you had families separated, where I have many friends whose great-grandfathers and grandfathers lived in New Zealand, but their parents were born in China because the wives couldn't come out. And sometimes they were separated for lifetimes. My great-grandfather was murdered in Wellington, and he never made it home. He never made enough money to make it home.
Yes, it's an extraordinary history, and the contrast with both the contrast with the situation now, but also some of those threads that continue are ones that I think we'll come back to in the conversation. Anton, just to bring you in, I mean, I think that the one of the distinctive characteristics, obviously, of New Zealand is the sort of biculturalism, and that's a very sharp contrast with this country. So how do you see this sort of contemporary multiculturalism sitting from the sort of bicultural base that is so distinctive?
Well, one of the things I thought when I read your piece was how many parallels there were with Maori families, and particularly when you were talking about describing the family connections and the great-grandfather and the auntie. I mean, it was like the real parallels.
Yes.
And I think in terms of also the racism that you experienced, I mean, similar stuff went on with us many years before, all that type of exclusion, not allowed to speak the language at school, beaten for speaking the language, all those. So it was just a repetition of that kind of colonial violence and exclusion. And also just to pick up on a couple of things Lloyd said, that, I do think that there's some really extraordinary writing in there, and whenever I sort of see a collection of New Zealand literature or art, I kind of feel hugely proud of the standard of our art and literature. And Cliff Fell's piece in particular, if I had to pick one, I just thought was extraordinary,
isn't it?
Yeah, extraordinary,
yeah.
and very, which I didn't expect to find from white heterosexual New Zealand men. Very, very sexy writing, and I thought it was a very sensual piece, and drew on Maori history, the history of the Pacific. Had this very international worldview. So, but I guess so in terms of that biculturalism. I think that sits at the heart, that's at the very core of our identity as New Zealanders. And Maori culture is a reference point for not just us, but everybody who lives there. And to me, I loved the collection, and while there were glimpses of that biculturalism, it was not the way I experience it, considering how much time we spend talking about these issues. Every New Zealander, no matter what, would have an opinion on the place of Maori culture, the treaty. Far more engagement than I feel here. And that was not as strong as I would have expected. And the other issue which we talked about in the green room, because the collection seemed like a commentary of social evolution in New Zealand, was marriage equality, which was a massive achievement. And when I was in Australia last year, just after that bill was passed, everybody was talking about it. Yeah, they were just, everyone I talked to, just like, we wish we were like you. And so those were two elements that I felt were a bit light.
Well, I think that what we realised in doing this was that this is one particular frame on it, and we scratched the surface. I think, Lloyd, one of the things that you were very engaged with in the thinking about this was that sort of notion of hybridity and how how this sort of merging happens and grows. I suppose that in a sense there's a platform and it's growing from that. Do you want to talk about that hybridity notion a bit, or?
Well, yeah, at the heart of institutional New Zealand is this bicultural model. But also in the art, in the area of arts, there's a certain kind of fusion of artistic traditions, Maori, Pākehā / European, that creates something that you don't find anywhere else. And also from the Pacifica community too. There's some extraordinary art that has arisen out of this meeting of cultures, which is very, very interesting. But just to come back to Anton's point, it's the kind of things that you're talking about, those particular social things, the marriage bill and all that sort of thing, slightly outside of the brief of this particular volume. However, in the volume there are two major pieces, one on the economy and one on education, that are kind of taking the pulse of the country at this point in time, that kind of sit outside of the parameters of this theme that I described earlier.
I thought, they were two of my favourite pieces because, apart from being involved in Indigenous literature, I'm involved in issues concerning Indigenous children, and Beckett absolutely nailed it when he talked about 40% of New Zealand children are Maori and Pacifica, and they fill up this tale of underachievement. So only half of Maori kids live with any qualifications. So, absolutely loved his piece in Right Orams as well. And I think both of them could see that is actually that's a critical issue in terms of our nationhood and our cultural identity, to have those groups of children excluded and othered.
Yeah, it is a fine piece, and Bernard makes the point that, just speaking about education, generically the task of education is to make sure the child who wants to become a doctor is able to become a doctor, but it's also to save the delinquent from becoming a delinquent. Apparently we're very good at the first, but not so flash at the second. And Maori and Pacific kids are disproportionately failing. And Bernard comes up with his explanation is that our education system is based around the written word, and these kids are coming from home where oral language is the king, not the written word. So they're starting on the back foot as soon as they get to school. But it is acknowledged, I think, within New Zealand. It's not something that's being flicked away. You cannot, in a country the size of 4.5 million people, there is absolutely no reason to abandon anybody.
But the extraordinary thing about it is we've actually known this stuff since the 60s. Research has told us this, that Māori and Pacific children are much more likely to fail in education than any other group. And what I thought was interesting, and the other part of it is that research also shows that that is because of the critical relationship between the teacher and the child, that they have lower expectations of Māori and Pacific children. So now it's really biting us on the bum because we've got this massive population swelling.
That's all true, and I think that those pieces are really important in the collection. The other part of it, though, which if I look at it from an Australian point of view, is the success stories. I mean, the success stories of integration and of respectful engagement. So the Sally Blundell pieces and the pieces around Christchurch and that dreadful catastrophe, terrible, just that ghastly ramifications and experience of that earthquake, but the rebuilding of Christchurch and the integration of many layers of settlement and history and pattern, and the physical environment. I mean, when I was reading Sally's piece about the role of the iwi and then the rebuilding of Christchurch, which is underway, I was trying to imagine a situation in Australia with, rebuilding that has occurred after major disasters, none of the scale of Christchurch, but still, catastrophes, the floods in Brisbane, the fires here, The notion of actually engaging with the Indigenous people and finding a multi-layered sort of sense of reconstruction seemed to me to be something that I couldn't imagine happening. I certainly couldn't imagine happening here, but I can't really imagine many other places where it could have happened either.
I think the picture's really mixed. So there are both these wonderful examples of partnership and continued exclusion. I just wanted to come back to the marriage equality thing as well, just to harp on about that. And I'm not just talking about it because, I'm gay and I can get married now. But why I thought it was really important was that I think it said a lot about us as New Zealanders, because particularly in the passage of that bill, what was really apparent was that anybody under 40, they didn't care. They didn't give a rat's ass. If you want to get married, get married. And I think that's why I think it was an important aspect of.
I do think that New Zealanders, as a generalisation, are quite open-minded, really. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but I think New Zealanders are innovative, and my husband is also from New Zealand, but he's lived in Geelong for 25 years, and he sees that a country's landscape has a huge influence on the people. And he gave this, ever since I've been in Geelong for just over 4 years, and my husband Kevin and I talk all the time about the differences between Australia and New Zealand. And he says to me, these are all the things that I thought when I first came to Australia, you're bringing them up too, it's just the same. And he said to me, look, when you're in Australia, you basically drive and you go straight and you just keep on going and going and going. Well, if you do that in New Zealand, you end up in a manuka bush because you're going up and down, round and round all the time. And he says, you know, Australians are used to just going straight and doing the same thing all the way. New Zealanders keep changing. They change all the time. In fact, they change so much that sometimes it can also be self-defeating, you know. But you do see that, I think, in the country. New Zealand is creative. We take risks. We actually are open to new things. And we don't think just because things have always been that way that they have to continue to be that way. And it's also been a lot harder in New Zealand economically. It's been a real struggle. We never thought of ourselves as the lucky country. We didn't have luck. We had to make it ourselves. And I do think there's a risk when you've had this idea of the lucky country for so long that you can get a bit lazy and you're not used to the hard things.
Lloyd, you've thought about that. Do you want to comment on that?
I haven't given it a single thought.
You haven't? I've heard you say things about the sort of the difficult, you know, the sort of the Australian sort of. It's more a reflection on Australia than on New Zealand.
I think it's more of a bad reflection on me. I think I was probably glass in hand, sounding off, I suspect. Well, I don't know. You know, I mean, every country is innovative. Every country is closed-minded. Yeah. You know, we're all these things, really.
I mean, I think one of the elements when you talk before about the sort of the gay marriage stuff and the sort of social engagement. I mean, what we did in addition to the book is we published a number of pieces with the conversation and you know, took that sort of policy discussion in a sense in that space. And one of the other areas which I think is very noticeable from an Australian perspective is the sort of position of women. So that, you know, we've endured a pretty ghastly period in Australia in terms of the sort of vilification and misogyny around women in public life, which has had lots of repercussions. And that when we look across to New Zealand, we see a different sort of framework, which, you know, has a long history.
I think it's got to do with our size as well, that it's small. So, you know, you'd have to live under a rock not to know or have been to a gay wedding or, you know, have a gay relation. I think it's harder for bigoted communities to kind of secrete themselves away because we're little. It's
interesting, I mean, just on the gay marriage thing, I mean, because of having done the Tasmanian collection last year, and one of the things, you know, that in Tasmania, the whole gay issue, you know, went from having the most draconian sort of legislative framework to being the most accepting. You know, Tasmania was the first state to very nearly pass the gay marriage laws in Australia. And the point that was made there was that the process of being in a small place and having small and personal conversations made it possible to actually get things to change in a way that in a bigger society it's harder to do. The things that struck me, I've got to say, I mean, the quality of writing in this is just truly wonderful. The range, the depth of voices, you know, from some of the, you know, very senior people through to very young writers. But the things that really stuck with me, I think, in a way, were about this, was the sort of watery, the place of the environment, how the physical environment had an impact on people. I mean, that sort of grounding in a very particular sort of place. Lloyd, you've thought a lot about that. I know you have. Here you go.
I have actually.
Yeah, of course, I got that one right.
Well, yes, it's a very watery place, rivers, lakes, and a very, very long coastline. And in fact, who was it? Greg O'Brien, actually, quoting somebody, Phil Dadson, who made the point that most of New Zealand, if you include the territory, you know, all the way up to the Kermadec and all the way down to the Southern Ocean. In fact, on ABC today, I think I said it was only 1/70th of it was land, and that's wrong, by the way. It was 1/17th. Yeah, 1/17th is land, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it in that kind of context. Yes, I mean it's you know, what Alison was saying before, you know, over here you get in a car and there's kind of an unchanging vista that has its own beauty. But in New Zealand, because of the topography, I mean, you're constantly being confronted by something new, and it's probably the strongest character, really, in New Zealand, isn't it? The landscape. It's a daily confrontation with something quite dramatic and changing.
I think it does have a profound influence over you, and I didn't understand it nearly as well until I came to Australia, because Australia is so different from New Zealand, and I never get over that. It's the landscape of New Zealand that I identify with, and the flora and fauna.
It's a softer, gentler landscape.
As long as you don't die of exposure on some mountaintop or something, fall off it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a softer, gentler landscape. And the other thing that kind of emerged for me reading through the writing is that, you know, as Māori, we, you know, the land, the sea, those things are really important to us. And, you know, I've definitely felt that evolution over the last 20 or 30 years, that I think all New Zealanders now share that. They share that same love of our trees, our land, our sea. And I think that in itself is a kind of an expression of our biculturalism, that those values are now shared.
And I think Maori culture has become so much part of mainstream culture in New Zealand. It's becoming stronger and stronger, and it's interesting that when I came here, I saw the difference, you know, and how much more influence in a real way Maori culture has in New Zealand than Indigenous culture has here. I think part of that is because we have more Maori as per capita in New Zealand than here in Australia. You know, there are so many fewer Indigenous people scattered about, not necessarily so much in the big populated areas, and with many different languages, whereas, you know, basically there isn't a lot of difference between the Maori dialects. You can understand each other. You can learn basically one language and know the variations, and we have so many words that we use day to day all the time that are Maori, and ideas that are Maori.
And I think I agree with you. I think New Zealanders want a slice of it, and I think that's great because it's what makes us unique. I went to learn Māori language last year at Unitec, and out of a class of 30 there might have been 4 Māori. The rest were Pākehā and new migrants. So people are intensely interested in it, and it's a good thing, it's healthy.
The other big thing which comes through is about leaving. A lot of New Zealanders leave. 15 of the 100 expat New Zealanders, you know, proportionally live in Australia, so it's a very large proportion of New Zealand-born people who live here. The weight of leaving on the home community, I think, is something that's sort of knowing that so many people are leaving, is something which I think is really important to explore. Steve Bronius writes a fabulous piece about working his way around sort of towards Auckland Airport and bumping into people who have newly arrived, and then getting to the airport, and there are lots of people going away. Hamish Clayton writes a fantastic piece about, you know, the aunt in the family who turned out to be the famous painting of one of his uncles had left New Zealand and come to Australia and had sent back a picture which the family took to be the woman he'd married, and it turned out to be Russell Drysdale's, a picture of Russell Drysdale's drover's wife, and they'd always thought that was Auntie Mary. So that sort of relationship with Australia of you know, coming and going, I think, is something which obviously has a big impact on a place.
Well, actually, on Steve's piece, it's a very entertaining piece, actually, and it's again, it was it's the result of a conversation about something else. We were talking about, well, how do you get around all 160 ethnic communities in Auckland? And so we came up with this notion that he would walk to the airport from Mount Albert. And he would kind of, pass through these kind of rings of settlement. And as he got closer to the border, which is the airport, there would be this sense of departure and arrival. But don't take this personally, New Zealanders who have made Australia home, but this is what he has to say about you. So this is in the airport. The new New Zealanders move slowly, cautiously. The departing New Zealanders, any minute about to become ex-New Zealanders, brayed and stuck out their stomachs and stocked up at duty-free. They were taking the New Zealand way of life with them, including the belligerence and complaint, the aggression and claustrophobia, and their large, stupid children with wizened, bitter faces.
None of them are here tonight.
Let me say something. New Zealanders when a New Zealander leaves New Zealand, they never leave New Zealand.
No.
And they always contribute to New Zealand. If they have the capability, they always do what they can for New Zealand. When the Christchurch earthquake hit, there were New Zealanders all around the world raising money for the recovery. Didn't matter whether it was in Geelong or whether it was in London, everywhere in the world. New Zealanders who do well wherever will, if they're a scientist, they'll do something to help New Zealand in science as well. I meet up with New Zealanders here who are very wealthy because they are medical people, They've got plenty of money. But, you go into their homes and they've bought Fisher and Paykel because they love New Zealand. They'll buy New Zealand chocolate, which was made very close to where I used to live in Pororua. New Zealanders contribute all around the world. Some of Australia's greatest Australians are New Zealanders. Fred Hollows, for one. But you can give all over the world, and it doesn't mean you don't love New Zealand.
I just want to say that I think anybody who leaves their country is ultimately a bit conflicted, and because I think sense of belonging, all those things that come through in the book, that unique positioning in the Pacific with the landscape, all those things, relationship with Maori and the people of the Pacific, the new migration, all that stuff that makes us unique. My experience is that when people leave, they are conflicted.
Which is probably why the rest of the world is noticing so much as people are achieving such enormous, notice in the sort of cultural spheres. That we're all noticed. The world has noticed. Now we've got questions from the audience. We've got a couple of people with mics on the side. Is there anyone who'd like to ask some questions of these? Good. Yes. Okay. There's a lady down the front here, and there's a lady on the other side. Yeah.
Is this on? Yes. Yeah. As someone who was born in Dunedin but has lived 50 years here, is there anything in your book? Most of your discussion today has been very Auckland-centric. Is there anything in your book about North-South relations, because that overwhelmed how it was to be brought up in Dunedin?
Finlay MacDonald's piece.
Well, sort of, yes. There's a very, very good piece by Finlay MacDonald on Auckland, and it's called Primate City, and that phrase, Primate City, was coined by an American geographer in 1939 to describe countries where one city just sucks all the energy and creative expression and politics and economy. And Auckland, after all, produces 40% of our gross national product. So we do have It's actually not a very good profile, apparently. All failed states have exactly the same sort of profile, a very, very big city and a long hinterland until you get to Dunedin.
And beyond.
But there is quite a lot of writing about the South as well in the collection. So it's I think there are sort of two pieces which are very specifically Auckland. Actually, at one point I thought there wasn't enough Auckland, but then when it all came together, we realised that it was. So yes.
But also that weird thing that Auckland represents the new Zealand, particularly with all the new migration and diversity, but it's completely different from the rest of the country. So it's a real conflict.
There's a lady there, yeah, that's right, and then a gentleman towards the front.
I'd like to congratulate you both as editors on a really outstanding collection. It's very impressive. I have a question really about the New Zealand literary scene. One thing that strikes me is that it's very hard to find anything that you'd call typical New Zealand writing, and I wonder whether there isn't really a sense of any kind of mainstream writing in New Zealand, and whether or not that's actually a good thing, because it means that literary editors don't have a prescriptive view of what a New Zealand book looks like, and that this is something that, if you look at the diversity of writing that's come out of New Zealand that's been notable in the last 10, 15 years, that in fact this absence of a mainstream might actually be something which is really positive.
Interesting. That's one for you. You know the...
Okay, yes. The whole idea of a New Zealand writer or an Australian writer is an odd description, because really the things that make a writer is other writing, and that writing can come from anywhere in the world. I suppose it's a cocktail of things. Literature breeds literature. It talks to itself. So, but then, of course, if I'm living in New Zealand, I'm hearing a particular cadence of delivery. I'm seeing certain things out the kitchen window, which are also elements, but not necessarily the key elements. I think the most important one is dipping into this thing called literature and responding to it. There was a phase, actually. In fact, there's a really good piece in here by Kate de Goldie, and it's talking about. It's sort of addressing. I can't. Who asked that question, by the way? Yes, thank you.
Lewis.
And it's engaging with the question in this way: Storyland versus New Zealand. And, we went through that very nationalistic phase in the 30s where there was this kind of self-conscious effort to plant, Maori words in New Zealand, trees and so forth. And anyway, Kate has taken the example of Margaret Mahi, who actually, at a time when there was this intense nationalistic phase, actually, she's a children's writer, but she would have lions and dragons and monsters all cohabiting. So, in other words, her particular kingdom wasn't New Zealand. It was from fairy tale land. And Elizabeth Knox, who is a contemporary of ours, she's the kind of inheritor of that particular way of writing. But I don't think anybody consciously sets out to write a New Zealand novel. They set out to write a novel or a story.
I think that the legacy and the impact of those very fine creative writing programs, Victoria University of Wellington and some of the others, has really helped to skill up a lot of people in terms of of building that self-confidence and that capacity in a way that's been, I think, really important as well. We see in this, so many of the writers, have come through that program particularly.
I think too that these days we probably feel a freedom to write whatever we want to write, and what we write about may be located in New Zealand or not, and there's probably a recognition now that there are so many possible voices, and we have the freedom to do whatever we want to do. I mean, just looking at your work, Lloyd, you know, you've got novels set all over the place.
I was just thinking of something that Patrick Evans said, a Christchurch academic, and he was taking a pot shot at New Zealand realism. And he said it usually involves somebody not very bright telling us something about somewhere that's not very nice. And so a whole generation of writing sort of could be hung up on that peg.
There was, yeah.
Just a question regarding sport. That's part of New Zealand's identity, culture, literature, but it wasn't mentioned.
Oh, you've got the great sport, Terry.
Well, there is a piece actually in here, and you're quite right. It's who we are. There's a piece by Brian Turner, who is a well-known poet and a cyclist, and his thing is a slight meditation on cycling, and also a gloat about winning a race at a preposterous age of 50-something when he had no right to. Sport is a great connector, no doubt about that. If we're talking about, integration or multicultural society, before that, when we had, largely a European Maori population, rugby clubs had an enormous role to play there, and they did. I mean, that's where, Maori and European met on the sports field and got to know each other in the club rooms after. It was a great meeting point, I think.
And I mean, the other piece that we've got is the John Saker piece on Steve Adams, which really, I mean, actually embodies everything that you've been talking about. Yeah, Steve Adams, the young New Zealander, he got drafted to the NBA, first New Zealander to actually be on the. There was Sean Marks before him, but Adams actually got picked up in the first round of the NBA draft with Oklahoma.
I was thinking particularly about Australia's perceptions of. I was thinking particularly of Australia's perceptions of New Zealand, because the Pacifica Maori culture comes across here in Australia as being sport-driven. Is that valid?
I wouldn't say that was its only expression. It's probably where Australians are most likely to see Maori and Pacifica, possibly.
And I think that part of what we try to do is we take those things as a given and then try and go to somewhere that will give you a bit of a surprise. So that's sort of a deliberate thing rather than a.
I was going to say I'd respond to that, but I'm not interested in sport.
Australians are. That's the way which defines Australia.
I'd like to say how wonderful it is to be here tonight to actually meet with you, Lloyd, having read a couple of your books already and having lived in New Guinea and relating to one of your books. And also the idea of this book, I listened to the interview on Triple R and came along because my eldest son is now living in Houston. And just to endorse what you were saying, Alison, that about New Zealanders who give back, I've been here for 15 years, and when I came, I had been struggling in New Zealand with a very large family, and from the moment I set foot in Australia, the struggle left me, and the children have gone on to do quite well, and I didn't realise that my business would become a trans-Tasman business, and that's been exciting, and I have definitely walked the extra mile for my Kiwi clients that come over and taken business back to New Zealand, and my eldest son has set up a business or a school really for underprivileged children in New Zealand with all the money that he's earned overseas. Mm-hmm. So thank you for your contributions. Mm-hmm. I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Actually, I wonder if there's a whole new culture emerging, a trans-Tasman culture.
I think we've always had a trans-Tasman culture. I mean, I know so many Australians in New Zealand, so many people who their mother or father in New Zealand is Australian and vice versa. And in the old days when you were coming to New Zealand from China, Hong Kong, You had to go through Australia to get to New Zealand. And so many of the early people in our history were in both places. When I was researching my novel, I found so many people who were from Australia in New Zealand or vice versa, or who went back and forth, and it has never stopped.
Yes.
Interesting.
Can I just say,
yeah.
I know that we're running out of time, but there's a very fine New Zealand painter in Sydney, Ewan McLeod, and he typifies this notion of a trans-Tasman artist very, very well. And some of his particular paintings I like. It'll be this sort of naked man walking in the Australian desert with a canvas strapped to his back, and it's of the Port Hills, where he's from in Canterbury. Yeah. And I think that's that notion, you never entirely leave home. Of course you don't. Your memory is always going back. Yeah.
And sort of thinking about that trans-Tasman thing in terms of the collection of Indigenous writing and bringing together Māori and Aboriginal writers, what I realised, I was talking about this over lunch today, was that even though we share the commonality of being Indigenous, our experiences are so different and shaped by all the things that we've talked about.
So we've got one last question.
So I was interested to ask Alison, well, all of you really, what you think the strength of biculturalism means for acceptance of people from other cultures in New Zealand. One of the reasons I'm asking was I was in New Zealand writing some features for a Hong Kong newspaper and speaking to a lot of Chinese New Zealanders. And one of the things they said was that they felt that New Zealand would never embrace multiculturalism in the same way that Australia has, because there was a sense, especially with Maori, we fought so hard for this biculturalism, we're not going to start giving it up to a whole lot of other people, a whole lot of other groups.
I think it's a very, very complex question, and I think it's very problematic because of the way different people understand these words. I think there is a problem here because there isn't enough respect here for Indigenous people and Indigenous culture. And I must admit that when I first came here, I was quite shocked at some aspects, you know, which I would never have found in New Zealand. But, you know, the histories of the two countries, although we've got so much that is shared, there are some quite profound differences, and one of those profound differences is the Treaty of Waitangi, which Indigenous people here have no equivalent of, and which means that their rights have not been protected and respected for too long. I know it's really complicated, but I really hope that all peoples can try to come into conversation with each other, try to understand each other and respect each other. I do know what you're saying, because I do know that there are minority groups in New Zealand that worry that a bicultural focus might mean that their own culture and identity doesn't matter. But I actually think that, I hope that we actually come to a stage where together all of us can understand the special place and that Indigenous people have, and that we can recognise that, respect it and nurture that, at the same time respecting and nurturing all the multicultural aspects as well, and be one people who are also many people, and enjoy that whole interaction. I mean, it just gives so much richness.
Yeah, and I think one leads to the other. That sorting out that the foundation of that biculturalism between Māori and Pākehā opens up more potential for multiculturalism. And I think particularly, in terms of the Māori side of that being really driven by self-determination and preservation of language and culture, that makes it much easier for us to accept that new migrants will do the same and give them space to do that. And my experience of new migrant cultures is that they respect and understand the place of Indigenous people, because they've often come from situations where their land and language has been stolen, and there's been issues around sovereignty, so they understand our place. And a few years ago, when I was going out night clubbing, catching a taxi, and I had an Afghani taxi driver, and he was kind of looking at me in the mirror and sort of figured out that I was Māori. And then he started saying, I have white people in the car and they moan about you Māori people. And I say to them, you stole their land and language, what do you expect, kind of thing. And as I left the car, he was shouting out to me out the window, you tell your people we support them. So I think that, to me I don't think they're exclusive of one another. I think they work together.
My grandfather decided to move to Wairoa, which is a very tiny little town in northern Hawke's Bay, because he heard there was a large Maori population. And because his English was not completely fluent, he felt more comfortable with Maori people because he could actually communicate with them better and got on very well with them. And I would hope that history that is in my family will continue and grow for all New Zealanders.
Well, I think that what comes through in this collection is how that sort of multi-layering and the speaking of different voices, different perspectives feeding into each other to create something which is new and original and fresh. I think that's the thing that you take away from this reading. So I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Lloyd and Alison and Anton for being here this evening. I hope you enjoy it, and good evening.
And just... And could I just say this, because most of us are New Zealanders, it seems, in this hall, that could we give a special applause to Julianne here, because this is an Australian journal that's given itself over entirely to a discussion of things New Zealand. This has never happened before. So thank you.
I confess up, my great-great-great-grandfather was a New Zealander. My grandmother was born in New Zealand, and so was I.